Don't push me, Your Honor. One call to my family, and this whole case disappears before tonight.
No one in Judge Judy's courtroom that afternoon was prepared for the sheer audacity of Julian Vance. He didn't just walk through the heavy wooden doors. He practically glided. Wearing a custom-tailored suit that cost more than the plaintiff's entire claim, the 19-year-old carried his lineage like a loaded weapon. Julian was the son of Richard Vance, one of the most ruthless and high-profile corporate attorneys in the state. His posture was perfectly straight, his chin tilted at an angle that screamed superiority, and a faint, mocking smile played on his lips. He didn't look like a defendant about to face the sharpest judge on television. He looked like a VIP guest arriving at a party he fully intended to ruin. The audience in the gallery felt it instantly. That heavy, suffocating wave of entitlement washed over the room. It's a specific kind of arrogance, the kind that only blooms in someone who has never heard the word no, someone who has spent his entire life watching his father's legal team make his messes disappear with a single phone call, a vague threat, and a heavy checkbook. Julian casually glanced over at the plaintiff, a 24-year-old freelance photographer named Marcus, who was suing him for intentionally smashing a $5,000 camera during a drunken fraternity party. Julian's look wasn't apologetic, it was pure disgust. He looked at Marcus as if the working-class photographer was a speck of dirt on his expensive Italian leather shoes. Stepping up to the defendant's podium, Julian casually leaned on it with one elbow. It was a pose so brazenly disrespectful that the bailiff visibly tensed, shifting his weight. Julian gave a quick, knowing wink to his frat brothers sitting in the back row. He genuinely believed this entire proceeding was just a mundane formality, a minor inconvenience before his father's reputation crushed this pathetic little lawsuit into dust. But Judge Judy didn't immediately speak. She didn't even look up from her case file. Instead, she let the silence stretch. In her courtroom, silence wasn't empty. It was a tactical weapon. She let Julian's smirk hang in the cold, tense air. Judy had dealt with hundreds of trust fund kids over her decades on the bench, but Julian's file was different. This wasn't just about a broken camera. It was about the text messages, the intimidation, the absolute, unwavering certainty that the law bent for people with his last name. When she finally raised her eyes, staring right through his expensive suit and straight into his fragile ego, the temperature in the room plummeted. So, Judge Judy began, her voice a deadly, quiet whisper that cut through the courtroom like a surgical scalpel. "You must be the legal prodigy." Julian chuckled, adjusting his expensive cufflinks. "Well, Your Honor, my father is Richard Vance. I'm sure you're very familiar with his firm. Honestly, we shouldn't even be wasting your time here today." The audience gasped collectively. It was the exact moment the fuse was lit. Julian thought he was asserting dominance. He didn't realize he had just locked the doors of his own trap. Judge Judy didn't blink. She didn't lean back. She simply let the name Richard Vance hang in the air until it sounded utterly ridiculous. In corporate boardrooms, that name might have moved mountains and forced settlements. In this room, it was less than dust. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that made the bailiff stand a little straighter. "I don't care if your father is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the King of England, or the man who invented the gavel. In my courtroom, you are not a lawyer. You are a 19-year-old defendant accused of destroying someone else's livelihood. And right now, you are standing on extremely thin ice." Julian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but his enormous ego quickly patched the crack. He gave a dismissive, theatrical little shrug, shifting his weight and muttering, "Whatever, just loud enough for the microphone to catch." Judge Judy ignored him for the moment, turning her piercing gaze to the plaintiff. Marcus stood rigid, clutching a battered manila envelope. Unlike Julian, Marcus didn't have a multi-million-dollar safety net. He was a freelance photographer who had worked double shifts for 3 years to buy the equipment that was now shattered into pieces. His knuckles were white as he gripped the podium. "Marcus," Judge Judy said, her tone shifting slightly, not out of pity, but out of respect for someone who actually worked for a living. "Tell me exactly what happened on the night of October 14th. Marcus cleared his throat, keeping his eyes fixed on the judge. "Your Honor, I was hired to photograph a private charity event downtown. Julian and his fraternity brothers crashed the party. They were extremely intoxicated and causing a scene. When security asked them to leave, Julian walked over to my station and grabbed my primary camera off the tripod. I asked him to put it down, and he looked me dead in the eye, laughed, and threw it straight into the venue's decorative stone fountain. Before Marcus could even finish his sentence, Julian scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes so hard it was a wonder he didn't lose his balance. "Oh, please," Julian interrupted, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "It was an accident. Someone bumped into me. Besides, it's just a cheap piece of plastic. I threw $1,000 at him that night to go buy a new toy. He's just here because he saw my last name and wants to extort a bigger payday," the audience murmured, utterly repulsed by the sheer lack of empathy. It wasn't just property damage anymore. It was the calculated humiliation of a working-class individual by someone who genuinely believed money erased morality. Judge Judy's hand came down flat on the heavy wooden bench. The smack echoed through the room like a gunshot. "Did I give you permission to speak?" she barked, her eyes blazing with a fierce, uncompromising fire. Julian flinched, genuinely startled by the sudden volume. His frat brothers in the back row instantly sat up straight. "I was just explaining." "Shut up," Judge Judy snapped, the iconic phrase hitting the air with the force of a physical blow. The entire courtroom went dead silent. "When I am speaking, or when the plaintiff is speaking, your mouth remains tightly closed. Do you understand me?" Julian swallowed hard. The impenetrable bubble of his privilege had just encountered its first real puncture. He gave a stiff, reluctant nod. "I ask if you understand me." "Words, Mr. Vance. Use them." "Yes, Your Honor," he gritted out, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Good," she said, her voice turning dangerously calm again. "Now, Marcus, you mentioned in your statement that you have video evidence of this so-called accident?" Marcus nodded, pulling a small silver flash drive from his envelope. "Yes, Your Honor. The venue's security cameras caught the whole thing." Julian's jaw locked. He had sworn to his father's legal team that there were no cameras in that hallway. Julian Vance's polished veneer doesn't just crack, it starts to disintegrate the moment Marcus hands that silver USB drive to the bailiff. Julian shifts in his seat, his expensive Italian loafers squeaking against the floor, a sound that feels like a gunshot in the sudden, expectant silence of the courtroom. He tries to catch the eyes of his fraternity brothers in the gallery, but they are suddenly very interested in their own shoes. They know he lied. They know there were cameras. Judge Judy plugs the drive into her monitor. She doesn't say a word. She doesn't have to. The screen flickers to life, showing a grainy but undeniable angle of the hallway outside the banquet hall. The timestamp reads 11:42 p.m. On screen, Julian is leaning against a wall, red plastic cup in hand, looking every bit the untouchable heir to a legal empire. Marcus appears in the frame, carefully packing his lenses. Then, it happens. It wasn't an accidental nudge. Julian saunters over to the tripod, looks Marcus dead in the eye, and with a slow, calculated motion, shoves the entire rig toward the stone fountain. The camera doesn't just fall, it shatters against the marble edge before sinking into the water. The video shows Julian throwing his head back in a mocking laugh, pointing at Marcus's shell-shocked face and mouthing words that the transcript later identifies as, "Go ahead and sue. My dad will buy and sell you before Monday." The courtroom is so silent you can hear the hum of the air conditioning. Judge Judy slowly turns her head toward Julian. Her eyes aren't just angry, they are cold. "Mr. Vance," she says, her voice dropping into a dangerous register. "That looks like a very accidental $5,000 splash. And it looks like you enjoyed every second of it." Julian's face is now a sickly, ashen gray, but instead of apologizing, the arrogance he's been fed since birth takes over. He leans into the microphone, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and unearned rage. "That video is misleading. It's been edited. My father has digital forensic experts who can prove Marcus tampered with the frames. This is a setup. You can't use this. Do you have any idea what my father will do when he hears you're entertaining this garbage?" The audience collectively gasps. Julian just threatened a judge in her own courtroom with his father's name. "Shut up!" Judge Judy's voice doesn't just ring, it explodes. The gavel slams down so hard it leaves a dent in the wood. "I told you to be quiet. You are not in your father's mansion, and you are not at a party where your name buys you an exit. You are in front of justice." She leans forward, her gaze locking onto Julian. "You just stood there and told me while looking at high-definition footage of your own malice that the truth is garbage because it doesn't fit your narrative. You think your father's experts can delete what my eyes just saw? You've spent 19 years believing this world is your playground. Today, that playground is officially closed." Julian tries to speak, his mouth hanging open, but Judy points a finger directly at his chest. "Not another word. Marcus, tell me about the messages he sent after this." Marcus pulls out a stack of printed screenshots. He said if I went to the police, his dad would make sure I never worked in this city again. The atmosphere in the courtroom tightened like a coiled spring. Judge Judy snatched the printed screenshots from Marcus with a speed that made Julian jump. She adjusted her spectacles, her eyes scanning the page like a laser through silk. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic tapping of Julian's foot, a frantic, desperate beat that betrayed the untouchable facade he was trying so hard to maintain. "Let's read a few of these gems, shall we?" Judy said, her voice dripping with a sarcasm that felt like ice water. "Message 1, she announced. My dad has the DA in his pocket. If you file that report, you're not just out of a job, you're out of this state. Message 2, hope you like flipping burgers, because that's the only place that'll hire a photographer who picks a fight with a Vance." Judy looked up, the papers trembling slightly in her hand, not from age, but from a controlled, righteous fury. "You didn't just break a camera, Mr. Vance. You attempted to break a man's future to cover up your own drunken stupidity," she stated flatly. Julian, cornered by the evidence, made a fatal mistake. Instead of shrinking, he doubled down on his arrogance, shifting his weight and letting out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Come on, Your Honor. That's just trash talk. Everyone knows how the world works. My dad's firm handles the city's largest contracts. Marcus is a nobody. If I wanted to ruin him, I wouldn't need a text message to do it," he boasted, clearly hitting his arrogance peak. The audience didn't just gasp, they hissed. This was the moment Julian's privilege met reality. He had openly admitted to a worldview where his father's power functioned as a license to destroy others. Judge Judy's expression went from anger to something far more terrifying, absolute decision. She leaned back, staring at Julian as if he were a specimen under a microscope. "You think power is a shield," she said softly, her voice carrying to the very back of the room. "But in this courtroom, power is a burden, and yours is about to become very, very heavy." She turned her gaze toward the back of the room, toward the double doors. "And since you're so fond of bringing your father's name into this, I think it's time we hear from the man himself." Julian's head snapped toward the entrance. His father, Richard Vance, was standing there. But he wasn't carrying a briefcase, and he wasn't surrounded by junior associates. He looked pale, his usually sharp eyes fixed on his son, with a look of profound, icy shame. "Dad?" Julian whispered, his voice finally losing its edge. "Sit down, Julian," Richard said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the sound of Julian's privilege collapsing in real time. The monumental silence that followed Richard Vance's entrance was more deafening than any gavel strike. Julian stood frozen, his hand still hovering near the microphone, his mouth slightly agape. The untouchable prince of the Vance legal dynasty looked as if the floor had suddenly turned into thin air. The swagger, the smirk, the dismissive shrugs, they all vanished, replaced by a raw, naked terror. Richard Vance did not walk to the defense table to stand beside his son. He remained in the gallery, his presence casting a long, dark shadow over Julian's expensive suit. Richard was a man who lived and breathed the law, a man whose reputation was built on precision and cold, hard facts. Seeing his son, his own blood, behaving like a common street thug in front of a national audience was clearly a humiliation he hadn't anticipated. "Julian," Richard said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of disappointment. "I didn't raise a bully, and I certainly didn't raise a liar." Julian's face turned from ashen to a ghostly white. "Dad, listen, it's not what it looks like. Marcus, he's exaggerating. He's trying to shake us down," he stammered, his voice cracking, the high-pitched desperation of a child finally peeking through the facade of a man. Judge Judy watched this exchange with the keen, unblinking eyes of a predator observing a failing herd. She didn't interrupt. She let the poison of Julian's own actions seep into the room. She wanted the audience to see exactly what happens when the privileged bubble finally meets the needle of truth. "Mr. Vance," Judy said, addressing the father, her voice unusually professional, "your son has spent the last 30 minutes using your name as a weapon. He has threatened this plaintiff with your firm's power. He has claimed that you own the DA. Is that the way you conduct your business?" Richard Vance looked Judge Judy directly in the eye. For a second, the two titans of the law shared a silent understanding. "No, Your Honor, it is not. My firm is built on the integrity of the law. My son. It seems Julian has confused my hard work with a license for his own depravity." He then turned his gaze back to Julian. "I received a copy of those text messages this morning, Julian. the ones you told me didn't exist, the ones where you threatened to ruin a man's career because you couldn't handle your liquor. I brought you into this world with a name that meant something, and in one night, you've turned it into a punchline." Julian's knees actually buckled. He grabbed the edge of the podium to keep from falling. His frat brothers were now looking at the ceiling, trying to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Vance family explosion. "But Dad," Julian whispered, a single tear of self-pity finally escaping, "you're going to help me, right? You can fix this. You said you'd always have my back." Richard Vance let out a breath that sounded like a final judgment. "I am having your back, Julian, by letting you feel the full weight of the law you so casually mocked." He looked at Judge Judy and nodded once, a gesture of surrender. "He's all yours, Your Honor." Judge Judy didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply picked up a new document from her desk, the one Julian didn't know about. The one that was about to turn a $5,000 property damage case into a legal nightmare. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," Judy said, her voice turning into a serrated edge. "Now, let's talk about the other thing Julian did that night, the part he thought the cameras missed." Julian's eyes went wide. The terror was no longer just about his father. It was about something much, much worse. Julian Vance looked like a man who had just been handed a death warrant. His father was no longer his protector, the courtroom was no longer his stage, and Judge Judy was no longer just a judge. She was the architect of his total reputational collapse. As she picked up the new document, the crinkle of the paper sounded like a thunderclap in the absolute silence of the room. "You see, Julian," Judy began, her voice dangerously soft, the kind of quiet that precedes a hurricane. "When you're as arrogant as you are, you forget that the world is watching even when the party is over. You thought the only thing you destroyed that night was a camera. But we have a supplemental report here from the local precinct, dated 2:15 a.m. that same night." Julian's breath hitched. His eyes, once sharp with malice, were now wide and glassy, darting toward the exit as if he could somehow phase through the walls. He wasn't just losing a case. He was losing his untouchable status in real time. "The venue's security cameras showed you throwing the camera. But they didn't show what happened in the parking lot 5 minutes later," Judy continued, leaning forward until she was inches from the microphone. "But do you know what did see it? The dashcam of a rideshare driver who was waiting for a fare." She clicked a button on her desk, and a second video feed flickered onto the monitors. It was a shaky, low-light angle of the parking lot. A sleek, high-end sports car, Julian's car, was seen tearing out of a parking spot with reckless, violent speed. In its path was Marcus's older, modest sedan. Julian's car didn't just graze it, it slammed into the driver's side door, caving it in with a sickening crunch of metal. The video didn't show Julian stopping to check the damage. It showed the sports car pausing for a split second, long enough for the driver to realize what happened, and then flooring the accelerator, disappearing into the night. "Hit and run," Judy stated, the words falling like lead weights. "You didn't just ruin this man's equipment, you ruined his only means of transportation to the jobs he needs to pay for that equipment. And then, you drove away, convinced that your last name was a get-out-of-jail-free card." The audience was in a state of shock. The spoiled frat boy narrative had shifted into something much darker, criminal negligence and a complete lack of human soul. Marcus sat at his table, his head in his hands, the weight of the last few months finally visible in the slumped curve of his shoulders. Julian tried to find his voice, but it came out as a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. I didn't know it was his car. I thought it was just. I was panicked. My dad's insurance will—" "Stop!" Judy's scream silenced him instantly. "Your father's insurance doesn't cover cowardice, Mr. Vance, and it doesn't cover criminal acts. You stood here today and claimed Marcus was extorting you for a payday. But the truth is, you've been running from the wreckage you leave behind your entire life." She looked at Richard Vance, who had turned his back on his son completely. Then she looked at the bailiff. "Make sure those precinct officers are standing by in the hallway. We aren't just talking about a civil judgment anymore." Julian's knees finally gave out. He slumped into his chair, the custom-tailored suit now looking like a shroud. The privilege bubble hadn't just burst, it had incinerated. The courtroom was no longer a place of debate. It had become a vacuum of absolute accountability. Julian Vance sat slumped in his chair, his hands trembling so violently that he had to tuck them under his thighs to hide the evidence of his total collapse. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the collective breath of an audience that had just witnessed the surgical dismantling of a lifetime of privilege. Judge Judy didn't reach for her gavel. She didn't need to. Her silence was more terrifying than any sound. She stared at Julian not with anger, but with a profound, icy pity that seemed to strip away the last remnants of his expensive tailor-made armor. For 19 years, Julian had used his father's name as a master key to every door and an eraser for every mistake. Now, that name was a lead weight, pulling him into the depths of a reality he was completely unprepared to handle. "Look at me, Julian," Judy said, her voice a low, steady hum that vibrated through the floorboards. Julian slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face bloated, with the realization that the untouchable prince of the Vance family was dead. In his place sat a terrified boy who finally understood that money can buy a lawyer, but it cannot buy back a soul. "You've spent this entire afternoon talking about your schedule, your importance, and your father's power," Judy continued, each word a deliberate strike. "But you haven't spent a single second thinking about the man sitting 3 feet away from you. You didn't just break a camera, Julian. You broke a man's peace of mind. You made him look over his shoulder every time he walked to his car. You made him wonder if his hard work meant anything in a world where people like you can just trash-talk him into silence." She turned her gaze to Marcus. The photographer wasn't smirking. He didn't look triumphant. He looked exhausted. The vindication was sweet, but it didn't erase the months of anxiety, the threatening texts, or the fear of losing his livelihood. "Marcus," Judy said, her tone softening with a rare note of genuine empathy. Tell this boy who thinks $1,000 is a toy what those 3 years of saving actually meant to you." Marcus stood up, his voice shaking but clear. "It wasn't just a camera, Your Honor. It was my mother's overtime shifts to help me with the down payment. It was the rent I didn't pay so I could afford the insurance. It was the only thing I had that made me feel like I could actually make something of myself. When he threw it in that fountain, he wasn't just breaking glass and plastic. He was laughing at the fact that I had to work for what he was born with." Julian's father, Richard Vance, let out a sharp, jagged exhale from the back of the room. He didn't look at his son. He looked at Marcus, and for the first time in the history of the Vance dynasty, a man of that name looked genuinely humbled. "You see, Julian?" Judy's voice snapped back to the center. "That is the nobody you tried to ruin. That is the man who is 10 times the citizen you will ever be, because he understands the value of $1 and the weight of a promise." She leaned back, the shadows of the courtroom falling across her face. "You thought you were the predator in this story, but you're just a small, reckless boy who forgot that when you play with fire, eventually, the whole house burns down. And your father isn't coming in with a fire extinguisher this time." The double doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. 2 officers in uniform stepped in, their eyes fixed on Julian. The civil part of the afternoon was over. The criminal reality was beginning. Julian's lip trembled. The privileged bubble was gone. There was no VIP exit. There was only the long, cold walk toward a life where his last name wouldn't mean a thing. The final 60 seconds of Julian Vance's life as a privileged elite began with the sharp, rhythmic tap of Judge Judy's pen against her desk. It was a countdown to a reality he had spent 19 years running from. The courtroom held its breath. Even the air seemed to freeze as Judy looked at the clock, then back at the trembling boy before her. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice now devoid of anger, replaced by a terrifying clinical finality. "You came in here thinking your father's name was a shield. You thought 60 minutes of television was just a game. But in the next 60 seconds, I am going to show you exactly what happens when the law stops bending and starts breaking you." She didn't look at her notes. She didn't need to. Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $5,000 for the intentional destruction of property, she barked, her first strike landing like a physical blow. Judgment for the car, repairs in the amount of $7,000. And because you used your social standing to harass and intimidate a working citizen, I am awarding the statutory maximum for emotional distress. Julian's mouth opened to protest, but the words died in his throat. He looked at his father, Richard Vance, but his father was looking at the ceiling, his jaw set in a line of granite. There was no rescue coming. "That is a total civil judgment of $20,000, due immediately," Judy stated, her eyes locking onto Julian's glassy stare. "But we aren't done. You're not just a debtor today, Julian. You're a defendant." She turned her gaze to the 2 officers standing by the door. "Officers, Mr. Vance is being sued civilly here, but your dashcam footage provides probable cause for a felony hit-and-run and witness intimidation. I'm adjourning this case so you can process him for the criminal flight." The sound of the handcuffs clicking behind Julian's back was the loudest noise in the history of that courtroom. It was the sound of a privileged bubble shattering into a million jagged pieces. Julian let out a strangled, pathetic sob, not a sob of remorse, but the sound of a child who had finally realized that his father's money couldn't buy back the last 60 seconds. Judge Judy stood up, her black robe billowing like a shadow of justice. She looked at Marcus, who finally allowed a single tear of relief to fall. "Marcus," she said softly, "go buy yourself a new camera and keep taking pictures, because the world needs to see the difference between those who build things and those who only know how to break them." She turned one last time to Julian, who was being led away, his head bowed, his untouchable suit wrinkled and stained with sweat. "Your father writes the laws, Julian," she said, her final words echoing through the hall. "But today, the law wrote your ending. Court is adjourned." The gavel slammed down with the finality of a guillotine. The Vance legacy hadn't just lost a case, it had lost its armor. As the cameras faded to black, the only thing left in the room was the quiet dignity of a man who had worked for everything he owned, and the hollow silence of a prince who had lost a kingdom he never deserved.